As she stepped outside, the setting sun casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, Vanessa made a silent vow. She couldn't change the past, but she could fight for a future where fairness was more than just a hollow promise, and she would. The story of Vanessa and Daniel teaches us a valuable lesson about justice, fairness, and the impact of past actions on our present lives. In our daily lives, it's easy to follow the rules, do our jobs, and assume we are being fair. But true fairness goes beyond following laws. It requires understanding, empathy, and the courage to challenge systems that may not always be just. We must recognize that our actions, or lack thereof, can shape someone else's future. If you have the power to speak up, advocate for someone, or question an unfair situation, do so. Silence often enables injustice to continue. Additionally, the past cannot be changed, but we can learn from it. Regret is only useful if it pushes us to do better. Whether in personal relationships or in professional settings, take accountability and strive to make things right moving forward. Finally, never underestimate the value of second chances. People's pasts don't define their entire lives. Just like Vanessa realized with Daniel, we must be willing to see beyond assumptions and give others the opportunity to grow and change. Daniel stopped a few feet away, his expression guarded. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "But I'd like to know." "Why?" Vanessa's heart clenched. "Why didn't you say anything?" he continued. "You knew me." Her breath caught. She looked at him, words catching in her throat. "Because I couldn't," she finally said. "I had to be fair. If I had said something, it might have jeopardized the case." Daniel studied her, his face unreadable. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah," he murmured. "That's what I thought." And with that, he turned and walked out of the courtroom into the world that had nearly swallowed him whole. Vanessa remained in her chair, staring at the door as it swung shut. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she had done the right thing. Not as a judge, but as a friend. Hurt and understanding flickered across Daniel's face. "Fair?" he repeated, his voice quiet but heavy with emotion. "That's the thing, Vanessa. The world has never been fair, not for people like me." She exhaled softly, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the bench. "You're right," she admitted, her voice laced with regret. "I wish I had done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." Daniel studied her for a long moment, the tension in his posture gradually easing. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. "We were just kids," he said. "We didn't know any better. But you do now, don't you?" Vanessa met his gaze, unwavering. "I do," she said firmly, "and I'm sorry." A faint nod was his only response before he turned, his back straight, and walked away. The sound of his footsteps echoed against the marble floors as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Vanessa remained seated, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had upheld the law, yet the trial had exposed a deeper truth. Justice wasn't just about verdicts and evidence. It was about lives shaped by systems far larger than any single person. Vanessa knew her role. She could not sway the jury, but she would have the final word if their verdict left any room for interpretation. The final day of the trial arrived, heavy with anticipation. Both sides delivered their closing arguments. Powell leaned on circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust the system's process. Marcus, however, pleaded for the jury to see beyond the surface. "Look at the gaps in this case," he said. "Look at the inconsistencies. My client was arrested based on assumptions, not facts. If we convict a man on uncertainty, then we are all guilty of failing justice." Vanessa listened intently, her face impassive, but her mind racing. Then came the waiting. The jury deliberated for hours. The courtroom emptied and refilled, spectators stretching their legs, whispering among themselves. Daniel sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly together. He had not once looked at Vanessa since the start of the trial. Finally, the jury returned. Everyone sat upright, breath held as the foreperson stood, a small piece of paper trembling in her hands. In the case of the state of Illinois versus Daniel Hayes, we find the defendant. The pause was unbearable. Not guilty. The room erupted a mix of gasps, murmurs, even a few relieved sighs. Order in the courtroom. Daniel's shoulders sagged as if an invisible weight had finally been lifted, but his face remained unreadable. He had won his freedom, but the battle had taken its toll. Vanessa's voice remained steady. The jury has spoken. Mr. Hayes, you are free to go. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom emptied, Vanessa remained seated, watching Daniel as he signed his release paperwork. For a moment, she thought he might leave without a word. But then, he turned and approached the bench. The room was nearly empty now, just a few clerks tidying up, Marcus gathering his notes. Marcus Reed, Daniel Hayes' defense attorney, introduced an expert witness, a forensic analyst who had meticulously reviewed the surveillance footage. The analyst took the stand, his voice steady as he explained his findings. Based on the height and build of the individual in the video, there is no conclusive way to determine if the suspect is Mr. Hayes, he stated firmly. Furthermore, after a closer inspection of the metadata, we found discrepancies. The timestamp on the footage appears to have been altered. A murmur spread across the courtroom. Vanessa Carter, seated at the judge's bench, took in the revelation with a carefully controlled expression. She could feel the shift, the creeping doubt that had started to unsettle the prosecution's case. The prosecutor, Richard Powell, quickly objected, dismissing the claim as speculation. The defense is attempting to undermine clear evidence, he argued. The video is still the strongest link to the crime. But the jury was no longer so sure. The weight of Powell's words wasn't as heavy as before, and Vanessa could see it. A shadow of doubt now loomed over the courtroom. As the day drew to a close, Daniel was given the opportunity to testify on his own behalf. Marcus had warned him of the risks. But Daniel insisted. He stood, the soft clink of his shackles breaking the heavy silence. When he spoke, his voice, though quiet, carried a raw sincerity that filled the room. "I've made mistakes in my life," Daniel began, addressing the jury directly. "I've taken wrong turns, trusted the wrong people. But I didn't do this." He took a breath, his fingers gripping the wooden podium. "That night, I was walking home, minding my own business, when the cops stopped me. They didn't ask me any questions. They just decided I fit the bill." His voice cracked slightly, emotion seeping through the composure he had been trying so hard to maintain. "I've been fighting my whole life, fighting to be seen as more than just another black man walking down the street. But I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter." A hush settled over the room. Vanessa's throat tightened as she studied the faces of the jury. Their expressions were conflicted, a mix of doubt, empathy, and uncertainty. This was it. The truth was no longer confined to evidence or testimonies. It was now a battle of conscience, a struggle against the weight of prejudice and assumption. She nodded. "He was with me. He had just picked up groceries. We were home together at the time of the robbery." The courtroom went silent. Powell immediately objected. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay from a biased source." Marcus responded calmly. "Bias does not mean untruthful, Your Honor. The prosecution has not provided a single piece of definitive evidence linking my client to this crime. Mrs. Hayes' testimony should be considered alongside their so-called evidence." Vanessa exhaled slowly. The case was unraveling. The jury watched Linda closely. She was a mother, pleading for the truth to be heard. Marcus turned back to Officer Harris. "One last question, officer. At the time of arrest, did my client appear to be in a rush, sweating, or out of breath?" Harris hesitated. "No. He seemed normal." "Interesting." Marcus turned to the jury. Would a man who had just committed a robbery and fled from a crime scene seem completely calm only minutes later? The question lingered in the air. Vanessa looked at the jurors. Some exchanged glances. Doubt was creeping in. The trial adjourned for the day, and Vanessa lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the edge of her gavel. She wanted to talk to Daniel, to ask him what had happened. But she knew she couldn't. Any interaction outside of court would compromise her position. Her resolve waver. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to uncover the truth. But for the first time, she wondered if the truth was something it could ever truly grasp. And as she looked at Daniel, her childhood friend, the boy who had once been her closest confidant, she realized that this was more than just a trial. It was a test of justice, and a test of her conscience. A trial of truth and redemption. The courtroom was thick with tension, the weight of the trial pressing down on everyone present. The defense had played their last card, and the unexpected turn left a ripple of uncertainty across the jury. Richard Powell, the prosecutor, stood abruptly. "The jury can use their judgment," he countered. "The suspect was wearing a red hoodie, and my client was arrested only 2 blocks away. The connection is obvious." Marcus nodded slowly, then turned to Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. "Officer Harris, did you recover a red hoodie from my client when you arrested him?" Harris hesitated for a split second before replying, "No, but it's possible he discarded it." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Possible? Did you or any other officers conduct a search of the surrounding area for this so-called discarded hoodie?" Harris's jaw tightened. "We didn't have time." "So to clarify," Marcus pressed, taking a step closer, "you arrested my client based on a vague description, without physical evidence linking him to the crime scene?" Harris's silence was louder than any response he could have given. Vanessa shifted slightly in her seat, the weight of her position pressed down on her. She had been trained to be impartial, to uphold justice above all else. But how could she do that when the person sitting in front of her wasn't just another defendant? He was Daniel, the boy she once shared childhood dreams with, now a man fighting for his freedom. And she was the one tasked with determining his fate. The trial continued after a short recess, but Vanessa remained deep in thought. The evidence was circumstantial at best. The only witness, the store clerk, had given a hesitant description, and the video was inconclusive. The only thing tying Daniel to the crime was proximity. But how many people matched the description of a black male in his 40s wearing dark clothing in Chicago? As the prosecution rested its case, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Then Marcus stood. "Your Honor, the defense would like to call one final witness." Vanessa nodded. "Proceed." A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and worry etched into her face took the stand. "Please state your name for the record," Marcus instructed. "My name is Linda Hayes," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Vanessa's breath caught. "Daniel's mother." "Mrs. Hayes," Marcus continued, "can you tell us where your son was on the night in question?" Powell insisted the person in the footage was Daniel, but the quality made it impossible to see any defining features. Vanessa leaned forward, studying the screen. Could this really be Daniel? His defense relied on an alibi. Had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery, but his friend refused to testify, afraid of retaliation from their community. Marcus argued that a lack of a witness did not equal guilt, but Vanessa could see the doubt flickering in the jury's expressions. As the trial continued, she felt the weight of her position pressing down on her. She had spent her career believing in the justice system, believing it could find the truth. But for the first time she wondered if the truth was something it could ever really grasp. And as she looked at Daniel, her childhood friend, the boy who had once been her closest confidant, she realized one thing. This case wasn't just another trial. It was personal, and she wasn't sure she could pretend otherwise. A test of justice and conscience. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. The moment was pivotal, the kind of moment where justice either upheld its promise or crumbled under its own weight. Vanessa Carter, sitting high on the judge's bench, watched as the prosecution played their next piece of evidence, a grainy surveillance video from the convenience store. The footage flickered on the screen, showing a shadowy figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The person moved quickly, reaching across the counter, before appearing off-screen. The prosecution insisted the figure was Daniel Hayes, but the quality of the video made it nearly impossible to make out any defining features. Vanessa studied it carefully. Could this truly be Daniel? He sat motionless beside his defense attorney, Marcus Reed, but Vanessa could sense his tension. His posture stiffened, his fingers interlacing tightly on the table. Was it because he knew he was guilty, or because he realized how fragile the evidence against him truly was? Marcus stood, straightening his tie, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor," he said, turning to Vanessa, "the prosecution is asking the jury to convict my client based on a video so unclear that even their own witness couldn't identify him with certainty." When the trial resumed, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Reporters scribbled notes, and the clerk shuffled papers as the prosecutor, Richard Powell, stood to deliver his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Powell began, his voice firm and authoritative, "this case is about violence. It's about a man who entered a gas station and, without provocation, attacked an innocent store clerk before stealing from the register. His tone was clinical, detached, as if Daniel were just another name in the system, another case to be prosecuted." Vanessa stole a glance at Daniel. He remained still, his gaze fixed on the table before him. Then, the defense attorney, Marcus Reed, rose to present his opening statement. He was young but confident, his voice commanding the room. "The prosecution would like you to believe that this case is simple," he said, "but it's not. My client, Daniel Hayes, has maintained his innocence from the beginning. We will show that there is more to this story, much more, and that the assumptions made on the night of his arrest do not hold up under scrutiny." The first witness, the store clerk who had been working that night, took the stand. He described a man fitting Daniel's description entering the store, arguing with the cashier, and then lunging over the counter. His testimony was detailed, but something about it felt rehearsed. When it was Marcus's turn for cross-examination, his approach was sharp, precise. "Mr. Chambers," Marcus began, pacing slightly, "you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie. Is that correct?" The witness nodded. "Yes." "Did you see his face clearly?" A pause. "Not really. It was dark and he had the hood up." Marcus nodded slowly. "So you're saying you couldn't definitively identify the person who committed the assault?" The witness hesitated. "Well, no, but—" "No further questions," Marcus said, cutting him off. Vanessa noticed Daniel shift slightly in his seat, his shoulders squaring as if that one moment had given him a glimmer of hope. The next piece of evidence was surveillance footage from the gas station. The prosecution played the video, a grainy, poorly lit recording showing a figure in a red hoodie entering the store. The suspect moved quickly, grabbing at the counter before disappearing off-screen. She had hesitated, glancing at Daniel, who stood frozen. His dark eyes met hers, filled with a quiet understanding. "Go on," he had said, his voice tinged with resignation. "I'll see you around." But she never did. Her father forbade her from speaking to Daniel again, and weeks later his family moved out of their Southside Chicago neighborhood without warning. Vanessa buried herself in school, her ambitions pushing her far beyond the streets they once walked together. She excelled, earning scholarships, attending law school, and eventually becoming a judge. She built a life rooted in justice, fairness, and order. But she never forgot Daniel, the boy who had taught her what it meant to stand tall in a world that often tried to make people like him small. Now, as she sat on the bench, staring at his name in the case file, she wondered what had happened to him after she walked into her house that night and shut the door on their friendship. His record was in front of her. A string of minor offense, petty theft, loitering, nothing violent, nothing that suggested the kind of man who would commit the crime he was now accused of. her back to the present. Daniel Hayes stood accused of robbing a gas station in downtown Chicago and assaulting the clerk. The prosecution alleged that he had emptied the register before being apprehended just a few blocks away with cash that supposedly matched what was stolen. Vanessa studied him as the prosecutor detailed the charges. His shoulders were slouched, his hands clasped in front of him, his face unreadable. Did he really do it? Or was there more to the story than what the prosecution claimed? The court adjourned for lunch, giving Vanessa a moment to collect herself. As she stepped into her chambers, her assistant, Sarah, knocked hesitantly before stepping inside. "Judge Carter, are you okay? You seemed a little distracted." Vanessa hesitated. Should she confide in Sarah? Would it be unprofessional to admit she knew the defendant? Instead, she shook her head. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." But she wasn't fine. How could she be? The past she had buried so deeply was now sitting just a few feet away, waiting for her judgment. The prosecutor described the alleged Crimea robbery at a gas station in downtown Chicago. The clerk had suffered minor injuries, and the cash register had been emptied. Daniel was picked up just a few blocks away, with cash supposedly matching what was stolen. Vanessa studied him carefully. His posture was slouched, his hands clasped in front of him, but his face was unreadable. Did he really do this? The defense attorney, Marcus Reed, stood to present his case. "The prosecution wants you to believe this case is simple," he said, "but it's not." He argued that Daniel had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. The friend, however, was too afraid to testify, citing fear of retaliation from the neighborhood. Vanessa scanned the jury. She saw skepticism in their faces. As the trial continued, she felt the weight of her position pressing down on her. She was meant to be impartial, a pillar of fairness. But how could she be when every moment reminded her of their past? She wanted to talk to Daniel, to ask him what really happened, but she couldn't. When the court adjourned for the day, Vanessa lingered at the bench, gripping the gavel tighter than necessary. She had always believed in the justice system, in its ability to find the truth. But for the first time, she wondered if the truth was something the system could ever truly grasp. As she watched Daniel being led away in shackles, her resolve wavered. This case wasn't just another trial, it was personal, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could pretend otherwise. A judge's past comes back to haunt her. One summer night changed everything. It was the summer before high school, when Vanessa Carter's father caught her sitting on the porch, laughing quietly with Daniel Hayes. His voice had been sharp, filled with an authority that left no room for argument. Vanessa inside, now. As the prosecutor began his opening statement, Vanessa's mind drifted to a time before the black robes and the heavy weight of the gavel in her hand. She and Daniel had grown up on opposite ends of the same neighborhood, divided not by distance, but by the unspoken rules of race and class. Her family had a small home on a quiet street, while Daniel's mother worked 2 jobs to afford their cramped apartment near the train tracks. Their friendship had been an accident. One day she had wandered too far past her street and stumbled upon Daniel at the local basketball court, shooting hoops alone. She had challenged him to a game. He had laughed but agreed. That one game turned into a friendship no one understood. "Vanessa," Daniel had once said, lying on the grass beside her under the stars, "you ever think about leaving this place? Getting out and never looking back?" She had laughed then, brushing off the idea. But Daniel wasn't joking. Even as a kid, he understood that the world wasn't built for people like him. It changed everything. It was the night before high school started. Vanessa's father had caught them sitting on the front porch together. "Vanessa, get inside. Now." His voice had been cold, sharp. She had hesitated, glancing at Daniel, who stood frozen in place. "Go on," he had said quietly, his voice tinged with something that made her chest ache. "I'll see you around." But she never did. Her father forbade her from seeing Daniel again, and then, weeks later, Daniel's family moved away. Vanessa threw herself into school, into ambition, into becoming something. She went to law school, chasing dreams of justice and fairness. But she never forgot the boy who had taught her what courage looked like. And now, he was standing in her courtroom, waiting for her judgment. She forced herself back to the present. A judge's reckoning. A past that won't stay buried. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, lawyers shuffling papers, spectators whispering, and the distant echo of a gavel striking in another chamber. Judge Vanessa Carter sat at the bench, her expression composed and professional. It was just another case. Or so she thought. The bailiff's voice cut through the noise. The state of Illinois versus Daniel Hayes. Vanessa adjusted in her seat, her hands resting on the polished mahogany bench. She glanced down at the case: Philly assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A familiar sense of disappointment settled in her chest. Another life tangled in the system. Then, the defendant was brought in. Vanessa's world tilted. The man standing before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, wasn't a stranger. He was Daniel Hayes. Her Daniel. Her throat tightened as memories surged forward. The summers they spent racing bikes down the streets of Chicago's South Side. The nights they talked about their dreams, lying on the roof of Daniel's apartment building, the childhood promise to always have each other's backs. But the man in front of her wasn't the boy she remembered. His shoulders were hunched, his face lined with years of hardship, but his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, were unmistakable. For the first time in her career, Vanessa hesitated. Daniel looked up, his expression a mixture of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes before he quickly looked away, his head bowing slightly. The courtroom waited. Vanessa forced herself to speak. "Mr. Hayes, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" Daniel's voice was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Her heart pounded. She wanted to stop everything, demand answers. What happened to him? How had their paths split so drastically? But she was a judge. She had to maintain control. "Proceed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt.